discussion.
Thank you.
Welcome to Behind the Pages. We are honored to have Joyce Carol Oates with us today. Joyce is an internationally known, award-winning novelist. She is a professor at Princeton University and NYU. She is here today to talk about The Lost Landscape. This is a memoir about Joyce's childhood. It explores how this rural setting of her childhood shaped who she is as a person and influenced who she became as a writer. Welcome, Joyce.
Thank you.
I'd like to start by having you tell us a little bit more about your memoir.
Well, the memoir is basically a coming of age of a writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at the roots of storytelling in my own life, and probably it's representative of many writers, going back to childhood. And I think for many of us, some of the original impetus of writing springs from wonderment and a sense of mystery and curiosity about the adult world. I grew up on a small farm. I was in charge of feeding chickens and gathering eggs. And I was sort of in this world of where children were working. And I went to a one-room schoolhouse. And my life was sort of circumscribed between the farm and the one-room schoolhouse. And then I was taken into town to a library. So I sort of think of the farm and the schoolhouse and the library as constituting my world at that time. And it was a very nurturing and exciting world, but there was a kind of penumbra around it of mystery and maybe a sense of danger and the whole adult world, things that I didn't understand. I remember coming into a room where my parents would stop talking, and just a sense that there were mysterious things going on that one didn't quite understand as a child.
Right.
So I think some of those areas of curiosity account for being a writer.
Yes, right. Your book started with I think it was the first chapter is narrated by Happy Chicken.
Yes, yes.
He tells her, I'm going to say he, even though I know it was a hen-laying chicken, so it had to be female, but you knew him as he. So he tells us about your relationship to him. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the challenge was to write about a little girl between the ages of 2 and 6. And though the little girl was me, I don't have a continuous memory. You know, I know there was a little girl, and I remember just fragments. I remember some things. And I have lots of snapshots. And so I wanted a perspective where I could talk about the little girl and the family and the farm, and maybe look into the future. And so I chose to write it from the point of view of a chicken, a kind of mythic child's figure of an animal. And so Happy Chicken was my chicken. There really was a happy chicken. And I remember petting him, and he would sort of bow down, and his feathers were very soft. It was just sort of a really loving little chicken. And so out of that feeling of loss and nostalgia and sentimentality, I wrote the piece.
How do you think your relationship with Happy Chicken influenced you as a writer?
Well, it wasn't just, I suppose Happy Chicken was one. I also had a number of cats. I think that when you live on a farm and live really close to animals, you have maybe a quite different feeling from what urban children have. Just like there's a family sense. And so when I did my early writing, which is basically just scribbles, I couldn't write yet, and drawings, all my drawings were chickens and cats. So it's almost as if I was a little girl, but the chickens and cats were like part of my family.
Yeah. And also, too, I was thinking that, when you have that kind of attachment to a nonverbal being, you learn to communicate through nonverbal language, and I'm wondering if that helps as a writer, because you get used to seeing a gesture have a meaning to it, and certainly in writing you don't want your characters to tell you everything. You want some of their gestures to do that, and I wonder if it makes you just sort of more hyper aware of the nonverbal language.
Well, that's an excellent question. I haven't really thought of it quite like that before. Yes, I think children are picking up nuances, a certain tone and music and atmosphere of a situation, for instance, where the language is almost not necessary. That's a communication. Children always know if they're loved. I don't think parents have to tell them, the behavior and the touch and just a feeling of being nurtured and protected. And I had a good deal of that. And a lot of touching and petting animals and hugging my chicken and hugging the kittens. A lot of pictures of my mother and me with holding kittens. So that was obviously a part of our life.
Right. And I think Happy Chicken used to come running when you got near the pen.
Yes. I fed the chickens and they all came running, but Happy Chicken was sort of a special chicken. And when I think back on it, I just wish I could go back for like 1 hour to experience all that again and see what really went on.
Right. Your grandfather died when he was only 53 years old. And this was caused by his exposure to steel filings from the factory. Yeah. What experience did you have with death prior to losing your grandfather?
Well, there was no experience prior to that. That was the first death in my experience, and it was so fraught with fear and not talking about it. So my parents really didn't talk to my brother and me about it. It just was this hushed shock, and my grandmother crying, and my brother and me being really scared.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until years later, probably 20 years later, that I realized that my grandfather died of a work-related illness, and that it was obviously caused by poor safety conditions in this foundry in Tonawanda. And my father was very lucky. My father only had emphysema. He didn't die till he was 86, so let's say he got through his life. But he was very ill with emphysema off and on, and he didn't have full lung capacity. And that was also from working in a factory.
Yeah. I think that sort of, and again, the same thing that when you're a child, you're not aware of the details, but you are aware in some way because you watched him die. I mean, he was home, he couldn't work for, I think it was a few years, wasn't it?
Well, my grandfather?
Yeah.
Well, I think I remember it happening very quickly and not really knowing what was going on. Suddenly, he'd always been so robust, and he was a terrible tease and very masculine in kind of old-fashioned way. And then suddenly I sort of remember him coughing and being sick and then getting weak. And so it was really very frightening to see this strong grandfather with a barrel chest and big whiskers, suddenly very ill. That really was scary.
Absolutely. Your father's mother is the one that introduced you to books through a public library. Can you describe your first impressions when you went to a library for the first time?
That was one of the great experiences of my life. So it was a Lockport Public Library, which is still a quite beautiful library, especially for a small city like Lockport. At that time, there were only about 30,000 people in Lockport, yet the library is quite attractive. I could just envision it set back in a little lawn, like a little park with wrought iron fence. It was very special. It was sort of like a religious experience.
Yeah.
And deeply spiritual for my grandmother. She took my hand and led me to the children's library, which was down some steps. And I got my first card. So all that was really, really profound.
What do you think your life would have been like if this grandmother hadn't introduced you to this wide world of books?
Oh, that's really another very profound question. I almost don't want to think about it.
Yeah.
My grandmother, as it turned out, we did not know it at the time, but it turned out that she's Jewish. She's from Germany. And she and her family came from Germany, but they did not announce themselves as Jews, and they went to upstate New York. And I think just were sort of non-denominational and hoping to assimilate into the landscape, so to speak. So we didn't know that she was Jewish. My father didn't know that actually he was Jewish, but it never came up. So I think like many Jews, my grandmother greatly respected books and going to school and learning and so forth. And so I kind of was the beneficiary of that. If I had not had that grandmother, well, of course, I wouldn't have been born. So it's one of these, hypotheticals.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because you also talked about the types of books that were introduced to you in school that you kind of had to read, the primers, and the difference between that and adult fiction.
Yes, yes. Well, I did begin to read voraciously as soon as I had a library card. So it wasn't so long that I was reading adult books. Not that I understood them, but I remember when I was quite young, and it sounds ridiculous, I had the dialogues of Plato. And I was actually sort of reading about this, and I don't know how old I was. I could have been 11 or 12, and it was just kind of amazing that I would be interested in something like that.
Yeah, because you certainly had choices there,
I guess I just had heard of Plato, they heard of some. And I took the book out of the library and was actually trying to write dialogues.
Wow. The types of reading primers that you did read when you were in school, sort of learning to read, what would you say the difference is with those in terms of plot as opposed to books that are written for adults?
Well, I scarcely remember. I guess Dick and Jane were the little stories that we had. But I really scarcely remember them. I started reading Edgar Allan Poe at home, and the plots and stories that I particularly read, like The Gold Bug, are actually quite obscure. There are two sides of Poe. One is fairly clear stories and narratives that are Gothic horror, like The Telltale Heart. Then he has other stories that are much more obscure and kind of turgid prose with long paragraphs. And I think I got sort of lost in those, and I felt that maybe the adult world was represented by that kind of turgid complexity and obscurity. Later on, I would go to read Henry James, and that's sort of the same sort of making a lot of what seems superficially simple, that beneath the surface things are very complex.
Right.
So I think I still feel that. That we live in a surface way, but in a subterranean way, things are very mysterious and deep.
Yeah, when I was reading that part of your book, I was reminded of my own earlier reading experiences, which were sort of similar. I read what I had to read for school, and then I read for pleasure, the books I could pick out at the library.
Yes, maybe mysteries. I think I remember reading Dracula when I was maybe 11 or 12.
Yeah.
And I read H.P. Lovecraft when I was very young, and he's so weird.
Alice in Wonderland was a gift from your grandmother. And you, for your 9th birthday, I think it was, you said that really changed your life. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Oh, absolutely. Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass did truly change my life. Those books by Joyce Carol were just so profound. Of course, when I opened the book, I had no idea this was a classic of British literature. I just completely fell in love with Alice and falling down the rabbit hole and then crawling through the looking glass into the looking glass world. That was very, very haunting to me. I can still see Alice crawling through and how I really identified with her. And in the looking glass world, that everything's backward and everything's reversed. And Joyce Carol had such a wonderful imagination. Of course, many years later, as a professor at Princeton, I taught Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass as adult fiction. There's a lot going on. It's extremely sophisticated and philosophical, and much having to do with Darwinian evolutionary theory. But as a child of 9, I didn't see any of that.
No. Although you did see a girl who was not perfect, and you liked her all the better for that.
Alice was plucky. She never gave in to fear. She never, she does cry maybe a little bit, but she never sort of breaks down in terror as a normal girl would. She always has a modicum of self-identity and strength and assertiveness, and that was very good.
I think a good model. I liked your description too about your early attempts at writing before you even could read or write. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'd really love to see some of these early scribbles that I had. I had a tablet and I had a Crayola and I would just scribble. And then I would draw chickens and cats, and the cats would be standing upright and the chickens were sort of like equals. But I remember seeing this scribble, and then I turned the page and scribble, It was sort of like Tolstoy was writing War and Peace, but he didn't have any words or any vocabulary. He didn't know how to write. He was like this little tiny 4-year-old Tolstoy, sort of scribbling. And there was so much energy that went into it that I wonder what was going on in my little brain.
Yeah, because, you know, I was really struck by your parents, by the way, I wanted to say, sound like they were really wonderful people.
Yeah,
you know?
they were
wonderful.
wonderful.
They provided love and nurturing in many ways, including writing. I mean, somebody had to remember to go out and get pads of paper and crayons and all of that, and they didn't have a lot of money, you know. So
that's right.
I think that in their way, it sounds like they were really wonderful people.
They were wonderful, and I'm starting to get letters from people who knew them, and people who knew my mother when she was older, after I left home.
Yeah.
And it's so heartbreaking and touching because they say, yes, your mother was so wonderful, and she did this for me, and she did that, and so forth. And she was so loving and kind, and it just really makes it sort of heartbreaking, actually.
Yeah, yeah. You discovered early in life that there was a difference between the type of writing that you actually did yourself, and then the kind of writing that you eventually, I think, wanted to do. Do you remember making sort of a transition to the the point at which you could actually read and writing your first stories?
Well, I think my first stories were sort of small novels, and I was probably imitating Alice in Wonderland.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And Alice Through the Looking Glass, because for a long time, I think that was my model. I also liked Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden.
Oh, yeah.
And that was another really deeply sort of private or even secret text, I guess you could call it, that I really identified with a lot. And that's more like more of a realistic kind of mystery.
Yeah.
You know, and that's about a little girl in India and coming back from India and all that. I mean, I didn't know any of the sociology or history about it, but I really identified with the idea of the little girl, the garden, and somebody's in the garden and hearing this boy crying. And, and it was so absolutely haunting.
And she was another character with real character.
Yes, with real character.
Yeah, she was crabby here and there. She didn't always obey, you know. I mean, she was really somebody
she was sulky,
who wanted to, you know, sort of know, you know, as children.
Like a sulky girl.
Yeah. Your father earned a pilot's license and took you flying out of these planes. I know you described that you sometimes even feel a sense of longing when you look at it down from a distance at even just the grass or a park or something like that. Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, some of my earliest memories are going up with my father in the Piper Cub, a very beautiful little airplane. My father took lessons and he got his license, and it was just a great dream of his. He didn't have much money, but he was able to rent a plane. I'm sure it wasn't very much money, or he couldn't have done it, at this airport about 4 miles from where we live. So early memories of going up with my father in the Piper Cub. Then later on, he was flying larger planes, and larger planes, actually. So I had quite an experience.
Yeah.
I'd be scared to death to go up in one of these planes now. But then I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
I always wonder what my mother thought when my father took us up in these little airplanes.
Yeah.
Because she would probably be standing down on the ground and watching, and I can only imagine how scared she might have been.
Absolutely, yeah. The fact that your father did this, what do you think you sort of learned about life from the fact that he got his license and flew? Well,
I think looking back on it, I learned a lot from my father. He was a very imaginative and adventurous person for someone who didn't have any money or any advantage. Right. He had to quit school when he was in 8th grade, and he never went to college, of course. But he has a sort of intellectual curiosity. He did a lot of reading. So I inherited a lot from him. Also a kind of skepticism and a sense of humor. Then from my mother, she was not very questioning. She was not skeptical. And she had a warm sense of humor. My father could be quite sarcastic. He was very sarcastic about politics. But my mother didn't have a lot of strong opinions. She was more a quiet person.
it seems too that the fact that your father did this with, as you said, didn't really have the money, managed to make it happen. It seems to me that by example, he was sort of teaching you, go ahead and chase your dreams.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have probably thought that.
No.
But I do remember them saying that they would send me to college if they could.
Yeah.
And they assumed that I would be a teacher. But as it turned out, I got a scholarship, so that was,
right.
I didn't really need so much money from them.
Yeah.
But in those days, $500 was a lot of money.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It sounds ridiculous in 2015, but $500 was so much money then.
Yeah, absolutely. And it allowed you, I think the fact that you were always sort of facing forward in terms of, it was that you were told you can expect to go to college. As it turned out, you got scholarship, but
right.
but you sort of led the direction of your education in the direction of college because
yes.
your parents had told you this will happen. And when you know something is possible, even though you know it's difficult, it's different than saying it's impossible.
You're so right.
You're
so right, yeah. My friend Russell Banks comes from a slightly different background, not so much economically, but sort of just psychologically, where in some parts of the world where people don't have much money, the parents don't want the children to get ahead of them. They want them to be on their plateau.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
It is because, as an adult, you can make a better decision, but when children are very influenced by their parents.
Very influenced, yeah. If you get the signal from your parents that they really are anxious that you not be better than they are, then you might say, well, I don't want to go to college.
Right, exactly. And that's, again, another nonverbal thing.
Nonverbal, yes.
There probably isn't a parent anywhere who would say, I do not want you to be more educated than me.
Yes, right.
It happens through, gestures, comments, that kind of thing. And that is actually much more potent, I think, than words.
Oh, the parent might say, I don't want you to go away to college. There's a perfectly good community college right here.
Yeah.
You don't have to go to Harvard.
Right. Your mother also, you talked about her and her childhood and how she was given away basically when she was a baby. When were you first aware of that, or did you always know that?
Oh, no, we didn't know that. I was first aware of that, I was probably 50 years old.
Oh,
it was much later. I think there was a sense that there were things not talked about. No, my brother and I had no idea about our parents. These people are quite reticent. Today we live in a world where people confess on television and online, and they tell you things you don't want to hear.
Right.
But where I come from, people were very quiet, and they were very private, and they had a sense of dignity and sort of self-protection. And people didn't talk openly about themselves at all. I mean, nobody would talk about how much money they made. They would not share with children any kind of anxiety. And though this is something unfortunate, but people didn't talk about illnesses. Like if your own mother had cancer, you probably wouldn't know that. It wouldn't be talked about. Particularly if she had breast cancer or cervical cancer or uterine cancer, you would never know about it. In some cases, the mother would just get sick and die, and the children would be stunned. Now today we have a very different consciousness where children and young adults are much more brought into the family.
Yes. Right. But it was different, and I was just very struck by how nurturing your mother clearly was when she sort of lived with this feeling that she was given away, because that was the word I think she
was given away.
Didn't she say that?
Yeah, she said my mother didn't want me. But she didn't really say that until she was about 84 years old. I mean, I never heard that. That was what so was sad, because I thought, well, all these many, many decades she was thinking about it, but she never talked about it. So she started telling me, her daughter, when she was over 80. And then she started crying. And it was so touching and it was just very sad. But they were also poor. I mean, her biological mother, I'm sure, didn't want to give her away, but there were, 8 or 9 children. I didn't know how many children.
Yeah.
Some people said there were 10 children. Some people said there were 9 children. And maybe somebody had died, you know, and those families with lots of children, often there was one that died, you know, and there were miscarriages. And so this is way, way, way back in like 1917, long, long time ago.
Right, yes, yeah. I was very struck by the car rides that you described. That you took these sort of pleasure
Sunday drive.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I was sort of struck that these two people who are so hardworking, really didn't have a minute to spare, went out on pleasure rides, and I love that.
Well, that was Sunday, the Sunday drive. I think people didn't work on Sunday. It was sort of a different world where stores were not open. Actually, very little was open on Sunday. I think you could go to the movies and maybe you could go to some restaurants, but lots of things were closed. So we had this little tradition of being in the car on Sunday. And I thought we went so far, but then I figured out that we had a radius like of 30, what was it, 30 miles or so, or 50 miles or something. It just seemed that we went for like thousands of miles. But when I figured it out, it was just little circumference. And again, it was so exciting because each road had its own character. And we knew all the roads, but then there were houses, and we knew all the people lived in the houses. And I don't know, it's just really pleasurable. So I can shut my eyes now and go on one of these rides where my mother was driving, and I could sort of go along and see the farm and this farm, and kind of go all around like 8 miles in a loop.
I can almost see, too, how a story gets created that way. It was almost like your mother was doing an oral.
She was. She said, oh, the people who lived in that house, oh, this terrible thing happened. And once we drove by, and somebody was sitting on a porch, and my mother said, her mother used to sit on a porch like that, waiting for boys to go by. You know, like the daughter of that mother was doing the same thing, like just sitting out on the porch. And my mother was sort of like talking about these people. And I remember hearing sort of fragments of stories, you know, like, oh, something terrible happened in that house, you know, or there's horrible people, or I can't talk about that.
Well, I can see that sort of, you know, and again, not necessarily in a conscious way, but I can see that sort of planting the seed of a story that came out later.
And then I would hear things from other children, like really awful things that went on that I can't actually even talk about, that I didn't talk about in the memoir, but really kind of scandalous, incestuous things and awful things that were going on that really were sort of felonious, you know, that we could get arrested today for some of these things.
Well, happily today, people would get arrested, I mean, just because in that time, I mean, you know, when you were describing your friend Helen, I you know, sort of brought back to that time myself, you know, because that wasn't a time when there was anybody to report that to.
Exactly.
You know? I mean,
exactly.
You know, personally, I wouldn't have even known what that meant at
exactly.
the time. But I do remember myself, too, having sometimes fear of certain people's fathers that I found out later. There was a reason for that fear on my part, not that they did anything to me, but I mean, that sense, but you didn't even know what you were sensing. You know?
Absolutely. There was not a vocabulary. Domestic violence was not a term that existed.
Right.
Sexual harassment, intimidation, even molestation. Those words did not exist.
Right, exactly, Well, I could actually sit here for the rest of the afternoon talking to you, but I think that unfortunately we are out of time. So you have been watching Behind the Pages from the staff of 22 City View. I'm Diane Goshgarian. Thank you. And thank you for being here. This is such a great discussion.
Tons more
questions. Things we could have actually talked about.